All right, let's find my notes here, and we will get started here. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we will begin. Heavenly Father, thank you this evening for your grace to us this day and every day, for sustaining us and preserving us, and most of all, for saving us and all the great blessings we enjoy and the hope that we have for the future. We thank you, Father, for the folks who've come out tonight. We ask your blessing upon them as we look at this material related to the intertestamental period between the testaments, and pray that this will give us a greater understanding of some of the events going on in the New Testament as we study that document. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. So we are looking, let me bring up this, let's see if I can do this. Get the wrong thing up here. We are, of course, looking at the history of the intertestamental period right now. And we kind of went way back in time and started with when Israel was at its strongest position, the time of King David and King Solomon. And I said then that was a period of time in the Middle East when some of the other great powers were weakened and not as strong. But then, of course, Assyria became quite powerful, and the kingdom was divided between Israel in the north, sometimes called Ephraim, or Samaria, sometimes called in the Old Testament, and Judea in the south, and with Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And eventually the northern tribes were taken into captivity in 722, we said, by the Assyrians. And then later, the Babylonians took over the Middle East, the Mesopotamia area, became the great powerful power there. And they controlled, Judah was really kind of a vassal, but they rebelled. And so the Nebuchadnezzar came down in 605, 597, 586. He finally destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, took way more captives. And so Israel was in captivity for 70 years. And then the Persians come on the scene. They conquer that same area, the Mesopotamia area, remember, and the Jews are allowed to return. And they are under still the control of the Persian Empire. But then Alexander the Great comes on the scene, and he takes over the Persian Empire, all that territory plus Greece. And he, after conquering all that, he dies in Babylon. And then the empire, as we said, is divided among his generals, mainly the 4 generals. And Israel, Palestine, is caught in between 2 great empires, the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, Alexandria in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire in Antioch, or Syrians. And we notice that under the Ptolemies, the Jews had quite a bit of independence. The high priest was really the sort of in charge of things there under the Ptolemies. But then the Egyptians, the Seleucids, and again, when I say Egyptians, these people were Greeks. Remember, all these people that's sometimes very confusing, that because they're in Egypt, we think they're somehow connected with the ancient Egyptian culture. They're not connected to the ancient Egyptian culture. They have nothing They have no real connection there. They're Greek, and they have Greek gods and Greek culture and Greek language. That's what they're doing in all these places. And so remember we said that under them, they wanted to, especially Antiochus the Fourth, wanted to really eliminate Judaism and make it strictly a Greek culture. This resulted in the Maccabean revolt. The Jews revolted, remember, and under a priest named Mattathias and his sons, 5 sons. Judas Maccabeus was the first leader, then Jonathan, and then Simon, his brother. So brothers here, and the 3 brothers. And under Simon, the Jews were able to gain a little bit of independence or a little recognition. They were still under they were still vassals of somewhat of the Syrians, the Seleucids, but they were continually gaining independence. And remember, Rome was coming on the scene, and one of the things that great powers do, like the United States, is, I guess, in this kind of politics, is to make friends with certain countries, and in order to ward off your enemies. The United States has NATO, so they can kind of hopefully keep the Russians under control, and so a lot of times nations will have buffer states in between them and their enemies. And so the Romans were interested. They were conquering the world. They were interested in moving into the Middle East, and eventually would, as we see. And so they were friendly and to the Hasmoneans. Not that they favored, the Judaism of the Hasmoneans or anything particularly. They didn't. But they wanted to keep the Seleucids. They wanted to weaken them. And so by supporting the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty here, that was a way to, keep things under control. And so we saw various rulers after Simon. Then his son, John Hyrcanus, came to the throne, 135 BC to 104. The Jews have about 100 years here, almost 100, 100 years from the Maccabean revolt, from 167, 166, when Judas actually conquers Jerusalem again, restores the temple, to about 63. But at least from 142, the dynasty, they have a good bit of control, self-control. And so Simon gives way to his son, John Hyrcanus. And he conquered more land, more territory. Let's see here. Let me look. Remember our map here showing the amount of territory gained. The green territory here, the green around Jerusalem, is Judas Maccabeus. And then the conquest of Jonathan is this light blue here, right here. He adds some territory. And then John Hyrcanus adds the orange territory here. So we're talking about all this territory now, the orange territory. So John Hyrcanus, remember, adds Samaria, and he adds Idumea. Idumeans are not Jews, but he compels them, remember, to be circumcised. And so this is incorporated in. This is important, remember, because we're going to talk about leading the sort of the leader of this province here, under the Maccabees was Antipater, and his son Herod became Herod the Great, an Idumean, but in theory, religiously a Jew, because they had been forced to adopt Judaism. So they were expanding their empire here under John Hyrcanus. Then Aristobulus. Remember, during this time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were fighting each other. The Pharisees and the Sadducees as parties arose during this period. And they vied for each other for political power. And the Pharisees came out of the Hasidim, remember, who supported the Maccabees. And originally, the Hasmoneans would have been toward the Pharisees, but as they became, even though they came out of that conservative pious movement, they became, as they gained power, they became more liberal, more open to Hellenization. And so they started favoring the Sadducees. And so John Hyrcanus himself began as a Pharisee and then favored the Sadducees. After Hyrcanus, then we had Aristobulus, we talked about last time, who was the oldest son of Hyrcanus, and he was a real Hellenist, ruthless Hellenist, and he had a Hebrew name, but he preferred this Greek name. We talked about during this period that it was common for many of these Jews to adopt Greek names, Hellenistic names. And he was just a tyrant, as we talked about last time. He imprisoned his mother. She died of starvation. He imprisoned his brothers and so forth. He called himself king. So the first time now, and you can look at the territory Aristobulus, this is this pink area here. So he's conquering Galilee here. He's taking Galilee, Aristobulus. So all this territory. The only thing left is this purple territory under Alexander Unias. We didn't talk about him last time. So they have all this territory here, everything but the purple. So the Galileans are commanded to be circumcised, people living there, to accept this religion, the Jewish religion, and so forth. And as I say, he called himself king. The king and high priest, and if the Pharisees didn't like the fact that he called himself king because he was not of the line of David, so he shouldn't be in the kingly line. So this uniting of king and high priest, they were very upset with him. So that brings us to Alexander Unias here on our notes. And I say here, I noticed, I mentioned here in the notes, under Alexander Unias, 103 to 76 BC, that when Aristobulus died in 103, his widow, Salome, Alexander, released his three brothers from prison. Remember, he had 4 brothers, and he imprisoned 3 of them, and he eventually, killed the other. But those 3 brothers were released by his widow, Salome, and one of the young ones, 13, who was 13 years younger than her. So she was 38 years old when Aristobulus died. She was 38. And this younger brother, Alexander Unias, was about 25 years old. So she appoints him king and high priest. So we have this uniting of the titles again, as we saw under Aristobulus, king and high priest, and she marries him. And again, he had a Hebrew name, Jonathan, as I say, but he went by his Greek name, Alexander Unias. He was also a thoroughgoing Hellenist. And he expands the kingdom, all this purple area here that we see, so that now, and it takes in all of this territory. So it's about the size of the empire of King David, and King Solomon, a very large empire now. Notice it takes in this area down here, which is in the news today, Gaza. All this territory, of course, it's a little further than where Gaza is today, but what we call Gaza today, but it takes in that territory there. So he, again, because he was a Hellenist, he sided more with the Sadducees. So, that gives us we'll talk about the Sadducees and the Pharisees a little later, but that gives us a little picture of what we see in the New Testament. Commonly the Sadducees are called liberals, and in many ways they are. They still held to the Old Testament, at least to the Pentateuch. According to what the knowledge we have, they just held to the first 5 books of the Bible. But they were very strict with that, and as we'll see, and the Pharisees held to the entire Bible, the Old Testament, but they also believed in an oral tradition, as we'll see, which the Sadducees didn't. So in some ways, the Pharisees went beyond the Bible and holding this oral tradition, but they kept the law pretty strictly, which the Sadducees didn't, obviously, and they were quite political, more than the Pharisees had been, but not by the time of the New Testament. The Pharisees aren't as much. So Alexander Unias reigned from 103 to 76. Now, as I say, he opposed the Pharisees. The Pharisees are pretty political at this time, and the Pharisees are upset because of his power, because he's king and high priest. He's departing from the Old Testament Judaism, they thought, as they understood it. And so they want to try to weaken him. And they decide to unite with the Syrians or the Seleucids. They as we said here now, the Seleucid Empire is weakening, and it's still, powerful at this time. It's becoming weaker. The Romans are moving in that direction, and so the Pharisees decide they're going to try to make an alliance with the Seleucids, with the Syrians, and get them to come in on their side and kind of punish Alexander Unias. And so they do. So there's some battles here and so forth. The Syrians come in, they help the Pharisees, but then all of a sudden the Pharisees get cold feet because the Syrians are quite successful in battling Unias, and they were afraid that once the Syrians get in, they won't leave. They're going to get control of Jerusalem, and they're going to get control. They're going to defeat Unias to the extent that they're going to take back the land again, and this won't be an independent state any longer, in a sense. So therefore, they decide to join Unias. They decided to switch sides because they're afraid. They suddenly become afraid of the Syrians. They switch sides and join Unias, and they were able to defeat the Syrians and drive them out. And so the Hasmonean dynasty is saved. Well, Unias, he doesn't think he he repaid the Pharisees by crucifying 800 of their leaders, 800, while their wives and children were being killed in front of them. So he crucifies these men, and while they're being crucified, he kills in front of them their wives and children. So we think, we hear news about the barbarism of these of many wars and things like that, but boy, these people back here were pretty barbaric, and some of the things they did. So let me just come out of that for a second here. So as I say here, under Alexandra, he dies in 76. So he, Alexander Eunymus, who said married the widow of Aristobulus, and as I say here, on his deathbed, Alexander Eunymus appointed his wife as his successor. And so she selects their eldest son, Hyrcanus II, as high priest, and his brother Aristobulus as military commander. So she's sort of dividing the power here between her two sons. As we'll see, that doesn't work out very well. They both want complete control, as Alexander Eunymus and Aristobulus before had both been king and high priest. Well, she tries to split this up. And as I say here, Eunymus had advised his wife to make peace with the Pharisees, since they control the mass of the people. So they had been battling. The Hasmoneans had switched sides to the Sadducees, and he said, make peace with her. And so she did. Her brother was a man by the name of Simeon ben Shechta. He happened to be the Pharisees' leader. There's a lot of interesting history about him, because as a Pharisee, he was having a difficult time during this period when the Hasmonean kings opposed the Pharisees. So she did. She made peace, her brother, and so forth. And as I say, this marked the revival of Pharisaic influence. So the Pharisees were pretty beaten down, and this kind of brought them back, sort of an equal plane. But they were favored by the people. As we see that in the New Testament. We read that constantly, that the Pharisees are favored by the people. Remember, the Pharisees, as we'll study, are men who have a profession. They're not professional politicians. They have a profession, but they study the law and so forth. So they're more people. Men of the people. So they're favored. So she makes peace there. As I say, she tried to keep the brothers at bay, so they didn't come into open conflict with each other. And she did a pretty good job. At least from 76 to 67, those years, they were a pretty peaceful period in the history of the Hasmonean dynasty. The most peaceful period, actually. No battles internally, no battles abroad. They weren't fighting, external enemies and so forth. And so this was a period of kind of prosperity and so forth, good relations there pretty well. This man, Simeon ben Shechta, is kind of an important man in the history of Judaism. He decreed that all young men would be educated in schools. So up until this time, boys would be educated at home. And he decreed that all young men, that schools should be established throughout the land, and that young men should be educated. There should be a comprehensive system of education, primarily in the Hebrew scriptures. So they would learn Hebrew and learn the Hebrew scriptures and so forth. And so a system of schools was installed in the towns and cities throughout Judea, larger villages and towns throughout Judea. So this is the beginning of sort of, schools, uh, Hebrew schools. I know when I was, I don't know if this is still true today, but when I was in school, not far from here in Virginia, growing up, I can remember that the Jewish students, we had a number of them, they would go to, after school, they would go to a Hebrew school where they would study the scriptures and learn Hebrew, learn Hebrew and so forth. I wish I would have found out more about that. I just know it happened, and they all did it, at least what I can understand. It was just a common practice. But it goes right back to this man here who started this idea of all children should kind of be going to schools. At least the men should be going to schools to learn the scriptures, to learn studying the Hebrew and so forth. So after Alexandria dies, she decides to, upon her death, appoint Hyrcanus. Remember, she had two sons there, Hyrcanus the second and Aristobulus the second. She had made one military commander and one, the high priest. She appoints a single leader, Hyrcanus, king and high priest. And so and you can see 67 to 66, he doesn't last too long, because his brother, Aristobulus II, as we see there, is not too happy with that. Just 3 months into his reign, Aristobulus declared war on his brother. Hyrcanus surrendered, as I say, and was forced to relinquish his position as king and high priest to Aristobulus and retire from public life. So Aristobulus was the military commander. He had control of the forces, the military forces, and he didn't accept his brother as king, so he simply led his forces to have his brother removed. As I say next, it's interesting that Hyrcanus, he was not a very ambitious man. And he was willing to accept this, that his brother should, rule, and he was okay with that. But there was another person on the scene, Antipater. Remember, I said that when the Idumea had been conquered by the Hasmoneans, they were compelled to be circumcised and so forth. And Alexander Iunias had appointed one of those Idumeans, a man by the name of Antipater, as the governor of this sort of Jewish, still part of the Hasmonean dynasty, but as governor of the province. And as I say, he was the father of Herod the Great, as we'll see. But Antipater had his own ambitions, and I guess ultimately you could say he succeeds because his son becomes the king over all of the area here, all of Palestine there, ultimately. But so he, as I say, could not be high priest. He couldn't himself take this position because he was Idumean. But he convinced Hyrcanus that Aristobulus had unlawfully taken the throne because his mother had appointed Hyrcanus to that position. And he said, "You're the legitimate king," and so forth, and your life's in danger. So Antipater, as I say here, persuaded Hyrcanus to seek the help of Aretas III of Nabatea to regain his position. And the Nabateans are a nomadic people. This map, I think, does show it here. They're there's the Nabatea there, and they're down here. I don't show it there, but it's in this area right here, Nabateans. If you see down here in the right-hand corner, a nomadic people here down in this area. Petra is associated with the Nabateans. If you know what I'm talking about, if you ever some have been there, you'd visit that place. And so he got the Nabateans to help Hyrcanus, and so Hyrcanus and his Nabatean Arabs, 50,000. So Aretas III had 50,000 troops, and he besieged, as I say, Jerusalem with Aristobulus inside. So we have this siege going on, and this persuades Rome to kind of get involved. Now, I'm going to talk about the history of Rome here in just a minute, but Rome has been looking toward the east. They eventually take over this area. They're looking at the Seleucid Empire that's weak, and they have already moved now into the Seleucid Empire at the time we're talking about here. They have sent a Roman general named Pompey to take control of this area, Pompey the Great. And so Rome was interested in stabilizing this area. There's another power I'll show you a map in a minute. There's another power that's arising in the east in Mesopotamia, where the Persian Empire once was, that we looked at on the map, called the Parthians, the Parthian Empire. And the Parthian Empire is very powerful. The Romans battled them for hundreds of years, and the Seleucids are kind of a buffer, and that's becoming weak. So they're sending Pompey there to take control of Antioch, that area, and he's looking at what's going on down here with the Nabateans, Jerusalem, and the fight between the brothers and so that's going on. And so anyway, in 65 BC, this is right about this time, 65 BC, the Romans had sent Pompey to the area, and so he's coming to the area, but he has a military man named Cyrus, his military tribune. He sent him first, and he's up in Antioch and waiting for Pompey to come, and they're going to come down here. I mean, this map here shows Pompey's campaign against Jerusalem and resulting Roman settlement. So Pompey's coming from Damascus down here, eventually coming to Jerusalem, but I'm getting ahead of the game right here. So first of all, he sends his tribune to Antioch and Damascus. His tribune is charged with controlling Palestine and taking control of that. And so Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, they both appeal to him. They know the Romans are coming. And so both of them, they're battling each other. Hyrcanus has his Nabateans, they're besieging Jerusalem. And so the two brothers, they know what's coming. And so they appeal to this tribune to support them, that they're the legitimate ruler and so forth. Well, by that time, Pompey arrives, and we can see on the red here, you can see that red line, you can see he just marches right down into Jerusalem. And the outcome of that is he puts down all this fighting. These people aren't any match for the Romans. The Romans are bringing legions to bear here, and so there's no match for this Roman army. And so the outcome of this is that when he arrives, he sides with Hyrcanus. For some reason, he thinks that Hyrcanus is going to be more loyal to Rome than his brother Aristobulus. So he sides with him. As I say here, the next, Pompey entered the Holy of Holies. He comes to Jerusalem, as you can see on this map. And he didn't disturb it. He restored it. He ordered its cleansing. He also ordered the resumption of sacrifices. Hyrcanus was reinstated as high priest. Now, the Romans are ultimately in control here, obviously, but Aristobulus resisted but was easily defeated. Aristobulus, his 2 daughters and 2 sons were taken to Rome as prisoners of war. So this marks the end of the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty, from 63 now to 63. The actual real independence is about 79 years, 80 years of Jewish rule here, of their independence. And that does, so takes another couple thousand years here before they establish a nation again. So this is the end of the Hasmonean house. Now they're still around. It's interesting. These people didn't always, like the Romans, they didn't kill the leading family members. These were still considered royalty. They had been kings, and the Romans didn't kill them. They took them captive and so forth. So they're still a powerful force. The Hasmoneans still have among the people a loyalty. I mean, they're more loyal to them than they are to the Romans and so forth. So they're still going to be a force. But Hyrcanus is now the high priest. So the Romans installed him. So you still got a Hasmonean there as the high priest. But he's just a vassal of the Roman Empire now. Rome is completely in control of the empire. So I want to talk an excursus here on Rome, because we're going to be talking about Rome, and Rome is very important to the future of this land. Now Rome is in control, and they keep control. At least the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, keeps control until the 7th century, till the Muslims, the Islam takes over, till the Arabs come in and take control in the 7th century. Rome, Christian Rome, once Rome, the empire becomes Christian, comes in, and then they're in control for the next 600 years, 700 years almost. So Rome is very important. So we want to just talk about Rome for a minute and understand a little about the Roman Empire, because, as we know, that's very important in the New Testament, because the New Testament is written under Roman control, and Paul and the apostles were dealing with the Roman Empire. So that is 640, and I think that is time to take our break. Am I right? 640, yeah. Let's take a break here, and we will come back in a few minutes and pick up in about 15 minutes, okay?
Yeah, I bet. That's ceramic. Relax. Wow. Yeah, I think that another YouTube does. I'll be much than for you. You really gotta be. I need a business. When it's 2020. Yeah, but you wait.
No, it's not me. I don't have time off. I can't forget.
Right.
Well, I need to fly down and drive her back. She has her own car. We went down there Christmas. Car.
So I see Tony and Eula there. So how's the resource center these days?
We got 2 dogs too.
Like,
Last year.
they can't hear me?
They're ignoring you, aren't they?
They're ignoring me?
Commanding this conversation.
Are they your dogs?
All right, let's look back at our notes here. So pray for Pansy. Remember I said she's going to the hematologist next Tuesday. So I'll let you know what they found out next Wednesday. I mentioned Dr. Mark Snowberger. He had that very serious open heart surgery at U of M, but he came out very well from everything we understand. He had an aneurysm. That was the reason they discovered an aneurysm, obviously from birth he had. And that was the reason they were initially doing the operation. Then they found out really his major problem was a valve problem. And I guess the valve's supposed to have a tricuspid valve. Our valves in our hearts are supposed to have 3 parts or something, 3 flaps. His only had 2. And his surgeon was able to create another one. So to repair his valve rather than replacing the valve. And the doctor in the ICU told his wife, Heather, that there are very few doctors who would even know how to do that, to repair that valve. He had the doctor he had at University of Michigan. That's the only surgery he does, is that surgery. So he was very fortunate to have that doctor, and he's home. And so he came home. I guess he came home Monday, but I haven't heard anything since then. Well, he sent an email saying he was doing okay. So we're thankful for that. He's got a recovery ahead of him, but I think he's going to be fine recovering. So let's look back. I just want to talk about Rome here just a little bit, because Rome is so important in the New Testament. So it's good that we know a little bit about it if you haven't studied this. There's a legend about the founding of Rome, and then there's what we know historically. The legend is retold by a Roman historian 700 years later, at least, but supposedly it was founded by a couple of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. Romulus killed Remus and named the city after himself, Rome, after Romulus. And they count their beginning with what they call the founding of the city, AUC, the Latin words, ab urbe condita, 753 BC. And that seems to be about right. About 753 BC, the city of Rome was founded. The Romans created, well, we assume they created this mythology about their founding, so it would be a great, have a great past, a great history. Virgil, who was a Roman poet, like the first real, I guess he's like the Shakespeare almost of Rome. When I took Latin here in the city of Newport News, when I was in I don't know what, this would have been the 10th grade, we read that poem, or parts of that poem, Aeneid. And this is a poem that traces the history of Rome. Romulus and Remus, the founders, their ancestor is a man by the name of Aeneas, who was the hero of Troy, a Trojan who escaped. And he escapes and he goes on this voyage, the Mediterranean, and he comes and founds the city of Rome. With Romulus, he comes and settles in Rome, and Romulus and Remus are his ancestors, descendants. And so that's the myth, that's the history that you read about. I say myth, we don't really know how much all this is true or not, but that's what the Romans created to have this glorious past and founding. We know that let me just bring up this map here. Rome, there's the city of Rome. Rome is on the city called the Tiber. So it's just south of the Tiber River. That's an, obviously important river. Get your water supply, well, a lot from the Tiber, although the Romans built aqueducts that brought millions of gallons of water into the city of Rome from the mountains and so forth, just a long way. You may have heard the expression crossing the Tiber. I don't know if you ever heard that expression, crossing the Tiber. It's used in a religious context when a Protestant becomes a Roman Catholic. So in the history and church history, you'll have people who leave Protestantism and become Roman Catholics, and it says they've crossed the Tiber or swam the Tiber, that kind of thing. When people in the Church of England would go over, like Cardinal Newman, he is said to swam the Tiber. And when sometimes Roman Catholics become Anglicans, left Roman, they said they swam the Thames, the river, and there to London. So this is Rome, and this map here is trying to show some of that. Historically, the Roman roots go back to, you see this purple area here, Latium. Here's the city of Rome in the orange kind of color here. And up here we have the Etruscans in the yellow here. We know that the Romans go back at least to these Latin people here on the lower side, the south side, the lower valley of the Tiber River. Now, we know that the Romans, and I should mention here, when we talk about Romans, we're talking about the city of Rome. So there was a city here called Rome that was founded. Rome eventually extended its influence, its power. It conquered all of Italy eventually, and then the known world, or a lot of the world, the Mediterranean. But it's not like anything outside of this was called Rome. So if you lived, in Spain, that wasn't Rome. Or if you lived up here where this is not Rome. Rome is only the city. And you're a citizen of Rome. A Roman citizen is a citizen of the city of Rome. So it's a city state, like the ancient Greek city states. It's not quite like we say, we don't say we're a citizen of Washington, D.C. We're a citizen of the United States, of a country. Well, that's not how they thought of citizenship. Citizenship of a city, though the city really controls all this territory eventually. But the Etruscans were a more ancient people here, or at least this time. They were a well-developed culture. We don't know a lot about them. We know only about them through their inscriptions. We don't have any written literature, but they greatly influenced, we know, the Romans here, and they controlled the Romans up until 509 BC. They controlled this area. The Etruscans, we know a little bit. We know something about their language. They got their alphabet from the Greeks. Now, the Greeks got their alphabet from the Phoenicians. We'll talk about the Phoenicians in a moment here. And the Greeks got their alphabet from the Phoenicians. The Etruscans got their alphabet from the Greeks. And the Romans got their alphabet from the Etruscans. And that's how it developed, we know. And so these were very important people. The Romans adopted a lot of Etruscan customs, culture, and so forth. And we know that today. More and more is being discovered about the ancient history of Rome and how it was influenced by these people here. But we don't know a lot about them, so much about them, because they didn't leave any documents, just inscriptions and things like that. I mentioned here under number 2 here, the Republic. So in 509 BC, the last king was expelled from Rome. Now that's the Etruscan king. So Rome, the city of Rome was controlled by the Etruscans. ruled over by kings. And a Roman Republic was set up, which lasted till 27 BC. So that's a long time, almost 500 years for a republic. And of course, the United States was set up as a republic, and it was set up. It took a lot of ideas from the Roman. Our forefathers took a lot of ideas from the Roman Republic. Now, in this republic, they had executive officers. They had an executive branch, you might say. And these executive officers were called consuls. There were two of them, and they were equal in power. They were elected annually, and they were advised by the Senate. The Senate's more of a kind of a legislative branch or an advisory branch. They're made up of the elites, the wealthy, upper class, and especially initially. In 449 BC, the Romans developed this law of the 12 tablets, which every schoolboy memorized. This was an important document. It stated general principles of law, but it marked the beginning of what we call the Roman legal tradition. And again, remember I said our forefathers looked at the Republic of Rome, other republics, but Greece and so forth, at least city-states there, Athens. But they got, what we understand, what I've read, I'm no expert on this, but that Roman law had a great influence on our Western law, certainly. Western Europe law and so forth, made on the Western legal tradition development, certainly. No, I don't think anybody doubts that. So Rome is a republic, 509 BC, and then they began to expand and conquer. As I say here, during the 4th and 3rd centuries, the Romans gradually expanded their territories to include all of Italy. So they start out, just as this little area here on the Tiber, and they began to take in other territory, and eventually all of what we think of as Italy today, they took control of. And I say they gave many of their defeated foes Latin rights. Now, as I understand it, that's a little different from being a Roman citizen. Now, eventually, they gave citizenship to people, like the Apostle Paul was a citizen. That was a little unusual for someone where he lived, where he was from Taurus. Not everybody in Cilicia, that province, was a Roman citizen. Everybody at that time in Italy was here, but they extended the rights of Roman citizenship. Many times generals did to conquered elites, conquered kings, and so forth. Like Antipater, as we'll see, and ultimately then that made Herod a Roman citizen. But they did give them rights. They gave them what they call Latin rights, so they could own property, they could have legal marriages, they could trade with, all kinds of things like that. So then in the 3rd century BC, so that's the 200s, the Romans launched wars of aggression, but of course they claimed that they were for defensive purposes. The first of these wars were called the Punic Wars. And these wars were with the Carthaginians. As I say here, are Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians are over here, and they're an ancient people, north of Israel. Their exact history, I've read a lot about this, but in the long before David and Solomon, there were some people called the Sea Peoples that documents talk about. The Phoenicians are thought to be part of those people. And certainly the Phoenicians were sea-going people. And they established colonies all through the Mediterranean, here in North Africa. Carthage, here's Carthage. over here, and they established colonies throughout. And they established colonies in Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily. The Greeks established colonies too. There were Greek colonies. There were the Greeks. They settled this area, and so there were colonies. They established trading areas and colonies throughout this area. But the chief power here were the Carthaginians, and so the Romans had a series of 3 wars with them. The first was the First Punic War, 264 to 247. 241, I'm sorry, 264, 241. As I say here, Rome established its navy here in order to battle the Carthaginians. And you can see this is purple here now. The purple says conquered in 200 BC. So the Romans took control of Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily here. This is what it's showing in the purple area here. So the First Punic War, they are able to capture this territory and extend their influence and gain this from the Carthaginians. As I say, upset by this humiliating defeat and heavy war payments imposed by Rome, the great Carthaginian general Hannibal launched the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC. So Hannibal comes into Spain here, crosses the Alps, and comes down into Italy. And he really wreaks havoc in Italy. He had elephants, that terrorized the people, all these troops and so forth. And he ravaged Italy for 14 years, up and down, winning battles, conquering territory, and so forth like that. He was never able to conquer Rome itself. And he was never able to fully, defeat the Romans or anything, even though for 14 years. But he was quite a terror. I don't know. I don't know if you can remember anything like this, but when I was growing up, parents would sometimes try to scare their children, maybe they still do, to make them do certain things. I can remember somebody saying, like, the boogeyman's going to get you. I don't know if if any of you ever heard anything like that, but get in here, the boogeyman's going to get you, or something like that. Well, according to what we read, the Roman parents would try to get their children to obey by saying, Hannibal's at the door. Hannibal's at the door, or something, that he was such a terror, it's like the devil, or something. And so they had that expression. Well, the Romans were able to defeat Hannibal by sending a man by the name of Scipio. He's called here Scipio Africanus. That's a name that was added to his name once he defeated Africa, Scipio of Africa. But they sent this general Scipio to Carthage. And so Hannibal had to come and defend Carthage. And he was defeated at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Now I'm going to mention Hannibal. He comes back to Carthage. He eventually leaves, and he comes over. He comes over and takes and becomes an ally of the Seleucid Empire. And the Seleucids and Hannibal is they're trying to defeat the Romans as they're coming through here. But anyway, so the Romans defeat the Carthaginians again, and they pick up more territory. They take care of this. They start taking all this territory around all Spain here, Spanish territory, and all this territory around here. They start taking control of that. But Carthage itself was not destroyed. Um, in the Third Punic War, 149 to 146, Carthage was completely destroyed. There was a Roman senator who got up in the Senate and he'd give a speech, and after every speech, he would say, Carthage must be destroyed. Carthage must be destroyed. And finally, the Romans, mounted an army and destroyed Carthage and completely devastated it. So after they defeated, I mentioned here, Carthage, they gained this territory. They looked toward Greece over here. And you can see what I say here, and a series of Macedonian wars, 214, 205, 200, 196, 4 wars here, down to 148. And by 148, they annexed all of this territory. All of this territory here by 148 BC. The Greek city-states were defeated. I mentioned the city of Corinth was destroyed as an object lesson. So because Corinth and Athens, all these cities combined together to fight the Romans just completely demolished Corinth in 146 BC. It was rebuilt in 46 BC by Julius Caesar as a Roman colony. And it was populated, like a lot of Roman colonies, with veterans and so forth. That was the Rome that Paul visited. The Corinth that Paul visited. When Paul comes to Corinth in if I can get my dates right, around 51, that's the rebuilt city from 46 BC. But here it was totally destroyed. So the Romans have conquered a tremendous amount of territory here. I mentioned internal unrest here. The Romans have extended their rule here, extending their rule all the way through here, through the area. I say the last century of the Republic was marked by interfactional violence. So Roman generals, following the example of General Sulla, who first marched his army against Rome, used their followers to try to enforce their policies. So there was a Roman general named Sulla who, 50 years before Julius Caesar did it, he came into Rome and took control and became a dictator. But as I say here, Sulla retired and tried to restore the Republic. So Sulla, the Republic was so corrupt that he took control of it and then tried to restore it and retired. And so you still theoretically had a republic, but there was these power struggles. They continued in the 1st century BC. And so, as I mentioned here, there were 3 important politicians, very ambitious men, formed what's called the First Triumvirate in 60 BC. This is Pompey, General Pompey that we've just been talking about, who is sent in 63 BC. So this is after he has conquered Jerusalem and conquered Palestine and taken control of Syria. In 60 BC, Pompey, Julius Caesar, and a politician named Crassus, they formed this triumvirate. So they're theoretically ruling together. I'll say Pompey was a famous general who annexed Palestine that we've just been talking about and other eastern territories of the Roman Empire. After Crassus' death in 53 and Pompey's defeat by Caesar, so ultimately Pompey is defeated by Caesar in 48 BC, Caesar took the powers of dictator. Caesar Caesar was an politician. This 60 BC, and he was all these men were consuls at one time. Caesar was a consul certain years, but Caesar, after he was a consul, he was sent up here into Gaul, and he conquered this area, what we think of as France today. And so he had, at least according to his account, he had great victories up here, and Rome annexed this territory, or really controlled this territory. He wrote a book about it called his Commentaries on the Gallic Wars, and he comes out very heroic in this thing. And he leads his legions. The legions were supposed to stay outside of Italy. Generals were not, these legions were not supposed to be brought into Italy itself, and it was considered, a criminal offense to bring your legions into Italy. And there was a river up here called the Rubicon. It's right up here in northern Italy. Up here, it's kind of the northern boundary between Italy itself and the provinces. The provinces are all out here, Roman provinces. And so he, in 49 BC, Caesar crosses the Rubicon. So we have that expression, somebody's crossed the Rubicon. It means there's no turning back. You've gone, the die is cast. That's what Caesar said, the die is cast. But he crossed the Rubicon. So by that, he was declaring civil war. He was declaring himself at war with the government. He comes in, and he as I say, he crosses the Rubicon. He becomes dictator of Rome. He defeats Pompey and so forth in 48. He's assassinated in 44, but a lot goes on. He goes to Egypt, Cleopatra. There's a whole saga there and so forth like that. But anyway, he is assassinated, remember, in 44 BC. And his nephew, Octavian, Caesar adopts him in his will. It's an important example of Roman adoption. We talk about adoption in the New Testament. We're adopted into the family of God. And adoption in the Roman custom, Roman sense, is not like our adoption. Like we talk about today, we're adopting a child. Like the Elwert ladies adopted a couple of kids. You adopt children to give them a home, to make them part of your family. But it's many times to help the children out. Adoption in the Roman system here was mainly a legal thing. It was like a will. So in order for Octavian to inherit Caesar's wealth and his title, his land, his wealth, he had to be adopted. And so this often happens. Like in the New Testament, you have when Paul goes to Corinth later on, we talked about, he meets up with a proconsul by the name of Gallio there. And Gallio is a very famous Roman. We know a lot about him. But he has been adopted by his uncle. Now, his father was rich. He was wealthy. But his uncle had no children. So in order for his wealth to pass to his family, he adopts Gallio, and Gallio takes his name. So this adoption was more for, we're going to give you legal rights, legal benefits. That's kind of what adoption is in the New Testament. We're born into the family of God by regeneration, but we also have this legal status as children of God, sons of God. In fact, Paul doesn't really use the word children. We're sons. As you know, it's John's gospel that calls us children. We're born children, but Paul says we're sons, and he's talking about legal rights. We have all the legal rights. We have this standing before God as sons. We have all the rights of a son and so forth. And so Octavian is adopted in Caesar's will. And so there's a second triumvirate that's formed here. I mentioned Mark Antony, who was a lieutenant of Caesar, and a man named Lepidus, a former consul and governor of Gaul and Spain. Here's, Gaul up here and Spain down here. Well, there's a whole intrigue here. Lepidus was removed, and Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra. So Julius Caesar was with Cleopatra, and then Mark Antony with Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. And so there's a battle here. It's right around here, this area here on the map. 31 BC, Octavian, because Mark Antony and Octavian are fighting for control of the empire, the Roman Empire, and they are defeated by Mark Antony and Cleopatra, defeated by Octavian in 31 BC. Egypt is then officially annexed as a province of the Roman Empire. It's been sort of under control, but Cleopatra is, the queen of it and head of it. But now it's become just a Roman province. It was a very important one because Rome got most of their grain, barley, wheat, from Egypt, from the rich Nile and so forth. So officially annexed and becomes a province. And the Roman emperors really keep a tight control on Egypt because that grain supply is extremely important. Octavian, Caesar becomes a dictator, and he's pretty arrogant way he operates. But Octavian, he becomes the emperor, really the first emperor. Rome's and Caesar's given the actual title dictator. But Octavian, he's given the title Augustus. We think of him as Augustus Caesar. So he takes the title Caesar from his uncle, and all these emperors are called Caesar. So he is granted the title in 27 BC of Augustus, becomes the first emperor of Rome. So the Republic is officially dead now. We're now in the empire period. And Augustus Caesar is the emperor when Jesus is born, remember, according to the New Testament. So Augustus is, and he's a very, excuse me, he's a very good emperor in many ways. He brings peace to the empire pretty much, called the Pax Romana, peace, Roman peace. There's a lot of peace, things are pretty stable. He's not really a dictator. He defers to the Senate many times, and so he gets along with the Senate. So things are pretty good during that particular period that Jesus is born and so forth. Now the empire gets some pretty bad emperors as we go along here. Tiberius, is not the greatest, but then we get to people like Caligula, and you got real problems. So now we come then to the Roman period, 63 BC, and we're back to where we were with Pompey. We're going back here a little bit. We're going back to Pompey when he comes through. Remember, he sides with Hyrcanus. and he's made high priest, but not king. And as I say, political authority rested with the Romans. But I see that 7:30. So let us stop here. And next time we will deal with the New Testament period here, because I'm just going to keep on going a little bit here till we get to the New Testament period, Herod the Great, because obviously he's very important and his sons are important in the New Testament age. So we want to talk about that some. All right, I'm going to stop this. Thank you so much for your attendance, and hope you all are doing well. You're getting all that nice weather, and hope your soul is well and your body is well.